Hello, welcome to Sunday Science Q&A. Today is a nature special. So any of the questions that you have that you would like to ask about the natural world, we will attempt to deal with that. And by we, obviously, I don't really count myself, though I have some knowledge. And due to one of our guests, I have greater knowledge on what to do with the gliss when you find one lying on a path, uncertain of what direction to go in. I think it turned out the gliss or edible dormouse, but please don't, was merely concussed and had disappeared by the time I returned. So, a few things to tell you before we get started. Number one, I'm wearing a hat, right, basically because it's really reached that stage now. The queues outside the barbers are still very, very long, so I decided I would wear a hat today and do my impersonation of Clegg, as Helen Czerski said from Last of the Summer Wine. Though there was some Clegg debates, there's been some confusion in terms of the hats of Last of the Summer Wine. That's the kind of issue we may well deal with on the Q&A as well. A few things. So first of all, we do all the shows that we do thanks to people who support us via Patreon. We always make sure things like Book Shambles and Sunday Science Q&A are available to everyone, but if you are someone who is able to also support us via Patreon, that makes it easier. Well, there's lots of other stuff that we do as well, and because we still haven't quite gone back into the live world, and I don't think really the return to my normal work's going to happen in the next kind of 4 or 5 months. If you can support us, that also goes to us making things like Tips for Existence, which goes out every week, where recently we've had on people like Andrian and Tim Minchin and Brian Green and Sarah Parkak and Francesca Stavrakopoulos and Carlo Ravelli. The one that's currently out now is with Chris Jackson, who any of you listen to him on Monkey Cage will know he was the person who persuaded you go and chew rocks when you're on a geological field trip. It will really, really help. There is no way that we can deal with any of your insurance claims for damaged dentistry. And also next week we've got Adrian Owen on, who is a fantastic, I highly recommend reading his book Into the Grey Zone. He's a neuroscientist who's done incredible work with patients who have been in vegetative states. So that's on next week. And also towards the end of this week, we have a new episode of Uncanny Hour, and it is about a science fiction classic which many people have only ever been able to watch once because it upset them so much. And it has an ecological theme. It is the science fiction classic Silent Running, and we've got a documentary about that on Friday, and that's got Mark Kermode and Stuart Lee and Brian Cox and Linda Marrick and Gemma Arrowsmith and Helen Czerski. We've made her watch a film. She doesn't normally watch films. I might even find out a little about that when I first talk to her. And next week is a medical week, by the way, on Sunday Science Q&A. And hopefully we'll be joined by Ben Goldacre, but he is always in a hurry and always, as you know, looking as if he's auditioning for to play Doctor Who sometime in the late 1970s. And we'll also be joined by Rachel Dunlop. So send in your questions. We have loads of questions in already. But if you have any questions, we have a live chat as well. And Trent will find a way of getting to me, because the thing I haven't told you, Trent, by the way, is that I don't have my phone with me today because someone in my family wanted to go and play Pokemon with their friends. So there we go. We'll work out a way of getting your live questions. So they're going to be sent to Helen instead. Let's go straight there. So Helen, it is. What did you think, first of all, before we have your "This Happened This Week" History of Science section? What did you make of Silent Running?
Before I get to that, I will say that if we do have Ben Goldacre on next week, everyone should watch, because it's basically twice as much bang for your buck, because he speaks so quickly that it's twice the show in the same amount of time. So Silent Running, I thought it. So for anyone who hasn't seen this, what can I say about the premise? It was 1972. Humanity's messed everything up. They put the trees into space to save the trees, and it's all about whether humanity wants to continue to save the trees. And so I thought it was, of course, there were the two physics things that really bugged me, right? You wouldn't do it out near Saturn.
We'll deal with sovereignty as well when we get to the documentary next week. I know there were issues there.
But I thought I was curious how much it was ahead of its time at the time, because obviously that was pretty much the Apollo program was just coming to an end. I don't know if it was released just before or after that.
It would have been just after, yeah.
Space was this amazing thing, and it was technology, and it's going to save everything. And so for someone at the same time to look back and go, actually, maybe we're not doing so well with all this, what we're doing to the planet. I'm curious about whether that was prescient at the time, because obviously Rachel Carson had published, there's all these, there was starting to be ecological things. So I think I found it's not got the most amazing plot in the world. I don't know. Maybe there are those out there who will disagree, but I thought it was really I wanted more historical context. So I wish I'd like watched a 1970 I don't know, Tomorrow's World or something before I started it, so I would know where people were coming from. But it was
Don't tempt me. You know I have access to all these archives in some way or other. So that's the next thing that's going to be thrown at you. Well, we will find out. If tune in, and Uncanny Hour should be out on midnight on Friday. As I said, Stuart Lee, Mark Kermode, Linda Merrick, Brian Cox, and Gemma Arrowsmith talking about that film. What happened this week in science?
So this week in science, we're going back to 1967, and Benoit Mandelbrot published a paper called "How Long is the Coast of Britain?" That's the easy part of the title. And the rest of the title is Statistical Self-Similarity and Fractal Dimension. And so Mandelbrot might be familiar to people as the guy he coined the word fractal. This paper is actually before he coined it. But what he is talking about, so I've got an example on my phone here. So what he was talking, where can I hold it so you can see it?
Yeah, that can
see
that.
So he was talking about how you measure the coast of Britain. So you can see in this example, we've measured the coast of Britain with a stick, which is quite long. So you can go around and you can measure how many sticks it takes to go all the way around. That's the other stick. Hang on. Oh no. Oh, it's all gone wrong now. That was not helpful.
That's great. Do you know what? This is very similar to a moment in Alan Partridge's This Time. So
that is obviously what I'm aiming for at all times. So this is the coast of Britain measured with a shorter stick, and so it's the same country, but it's until the politics changes it. But the length is longer. And so and what Mandelbrot was doing, so he was a mathematician who had access to early computers, and so he made these very beautiful figures, and he basically said that roughness, there are types of roughness which, however small you go, they still stay rough. So if you zoom in and zoom in, they're still rough, and you zoom in on the rough bits and then they've got little rough bits, and you zoom in on those and it's still got little rough bits. And so the importance of this paper was that he started thinking about fractals as things that happen in nature, which is why I picked it for this week. So it's not just a mathematical, an equation you can come up with and you can invent a fractal dimension for a mathematical object. It's actually seen in real life, and coastlines were his example of why this works. And this was like his work kind of went on for several years. It only really hit the mainstream in 1982. He published a book that I've just forgotten the name of called The Fractal Geometry of Nature, and that was when it really hit the mainstream in 1982. But he'd been working on this idea for sort of 15 years on the mathematics of it, and this idea that nature, I mean, the way I think of it is it keeps being beautiful however far down you go. And so that it was a big idea in mathematics, and he's 10, but he was recognized when he died as one of the mathematicians who contributed most to our view of the world. So yeah, 1967 that was. And if you'd like to go measuring the coastline of Britain, the rule is the thing you have to do is decide how big your ruler's going to be, because that's the thing that will determine what your answer is.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Helen. Now we're going to go to another Helen Scales, whose latest book is The Brilliant Abyss. Helen, how are you?
I'm very well, Robin. Thank you, Robin. How are you?
I'm good. I wanted to. Now you've got some beautiful pictures behind you, by the way. They
are nice, aren't they? Yes. The fish is good.
Who did the fish? Who's that?
It's an Australian artist. It was actually for a campaign on the Ningaloo Reef on the west coast to stop it from having a massive marina being built, and then artists produced these prints to raise some money for a campaign that was successful, and they did not build the enormous ugly marina, and they left that beautiful reef more intact. So that.
And your cover for this book is fantastic because it has that great element, as we found with Octonauts, which I think is one of the best programs that has ever been made. The way that, and as your books do as well, they introduce us to a world which undersea almost seems mythological. There are times where it's so beautifully fantastical, and yet it is reality. And I think that cover of the book really kind of conveys that as well.
Oh, it's lovely, isn't it? It's the artwork of the artist Aaron John Gregory. He's a Californian. He's done my last 3 covers actually, and I always kind of. Yeah, each time they get more complicated, I sent him longer and longer lists of things I'd like to depict on the front, and he always just goes with it and is incredibly just brilliant at translating all these ideas. Yeah, it's great fun. The colours and the creatures. Yeah, you don't need to make stuff up. You just need to look in the deep sea for like weird and really weird and wonderful stuff. You just have to look in the deep. Someone tweeted me today, they're reading the book, and they're like, if I didn't know Helen Scales and how scientific she is, I'd think she'd made this up. And the pig's butt worm, what? This thing that just does look like a pig's bum that floats around in the deep sea, and for good reason too, being that shape and being full of jelly. I'm going to see if I can show you a picture of this. that guy there.
Yeah.
No, that one. It works. There are reasons why it makes sense for things to be the way they are in the deep sea, and it is very wonderful.
Well, it's very much one who is trying to design an extraterrestrial. You need to go deep down, and you will find those things which have, the elements of H.R. Geiger and beyond. Now, what is your show and tell today?
Right, so I have got this. I'm not going to ask for any guesses as to what it is because it doesn't look like much, but it is pretty cool. This is the fossilized ear bone of a pygmy sperm whale, Cogeopsis. It lived about 15 million years ago. And the equivalent bone that we have in our heads, in our ears, is about the size of a marble. And for a whale, it's really significant that they're big and massive and really solid bones. I mean, this is a fossil, but even before it was fossilized, it's still massive and big. And it helps them to hear underwater. So it's one of the key adaptations that whales, 50 million years ago, those land-living mammals went, you know what, let's go back to where we came from and go back to where the fish began all of this. But they had a whole bunch of things they needed to be able to do that on land it wasn't necessary. So, if you jump in a swimming pool, you can't hear very well because your inner ears, your ear tubes get full of water, and that sort of damps down the conduction of sound waves. So whales evolved a different way of doing it. They have massive bones, so the sound is basically conducted along this bone, along their jaw bones, through their skulls, through this massive bone into their inner ears, and that's how they hear. But it was like a key part in their evolution. And this is a sperm whale. And they were about the size of dolphins, apparently. I mean, there's still there's 2 species of pygmy sperm whale now, and they're quite little and cute. But the big ones do fish in the deep sea, and I write about that in the book, about how sperm whales hunt for like an hour at a time at 1,000, 2,000 meters down for giant squid. I mean, how cool is that? Super, super cool stuff.
That's right. Can we just have another look at that a little bit close to the camera, just so get that?
So it's a little bit broken. I'm trying to figure out if I can point in the right direction. It's
brilliant.
Sort of shaped, and if you can make out, it has basically got a really thick edge to it. And this is the kind of the solid nature of it really is the key. And I mean, this is what, especially any of the whales that live today that have really acoustic lives. So sperm whales particularly, they make sound they hunt with sound like bats. So for them, echolocation is super important for the way they can hunt around in the deep sea. So they need to be able to hear those sounds that they make themselves bouncing back off things so they can figure out what's there. And a really big solid ear bone is going to do it for them. So yeah, pretty cool.
That
and
is wonderful.
Say it was found. This was given to me by a friend who found it in a river in the United States, in the eastern United States. There are places basically where all these fossils get washed out into these black, thick, muddy rivers. And he goes diving. He can't see anything. He's kind of groping around. There's crocodiles and alligators and things, probably alligators. And he just sort of scoops stuff up from the seabed and picks out like shark's teeth and whale ear bones and things like that. And he gave me one of his spare ones.
Brilliant. What a wonderful thing to have a spare. Our next guest is someone who gave me actually one of my favourite. I interviewed him for the book, which I'm finally finishing today. I'm doing the final copy edit today, and when I interviewed Hugh, he told me it's actually a quotation from an ornithologist friend of his, which I'm probably going to get slightly wrong, but it is: scientists do themselves a great disservice should they dismiss the unquantifiable. It's approximately that, I think. Hugh Warwick is amongst other things. He's many other things apart from a hedgehog expert, but his hedgehog work is fantastic, and he told me a great story as well of his first true friendship with a hedgehog as well, when he was bathing once a week in a farmhouse. Hugh, what was that? Did I get that quote approximately right? Didn't I? From your ornithologist?
Approximately, and it's that idea. We were actually talking about love, and I was writing a book about people's relationships with nature and whether any of the experts I was talking to would slip across that sort of dubious line between liking and loving the natural world. And it's Andrew Lack. He's a botanist as well. His dad was the famous ornithologist. His dad was the one who did all the work with swifts in the Natural History Museum in Oxford. So he was talking about that. Yeah, and scientists do themselves a disservice if they ignore the importance of the unquantifiable. I think is really crucial because I think it stops you becoming too arrogant. So I treasure that bit.
And as well, I don't have my copy. Is still at my dad's. He loves that book. It's the Hedgehog book by Graf.
So here we go.
I'm sure you have one.
Well, this is particularly pertinent because today sees the start of Hedgehog Awareness Week, which is I have lots of friends saying, well, so what are you going to be doing for Hedgehog Awareness Week? And I say, well, basically the same as what I do for the other 51 weeks of the year. So yes, I've done pre-recorded for this morning, and I shall be cavorting with who am I doing? One show tomorrow, and it's just like the usual thing, but just a bit more of. So I shall be doing hedgehog awareness and alerting people to the demise and the delight and the definite opportunities for fun and games with hedgehogs. I was not sharing a bath with the hedgehoggers. You were talking about my night.
No, I said it was during the time that you were having a bath once a week in a farmhouse, not with the hedgehog, but the audience's imagination to create this level of hedgehog erotica.
Yeah, and it was, thank you. And hedgehog, oh God, don't even get me started on that. Did you just use Google carefully? Okay, we'll move on.
Yeah, we won't talk about your next book, but it's about the natural world, but it's been problematic in terms of the algorithms involved. So what is your show and tell?
So I have, you see, if I'd known what Helen was going to be bringing, then I'd have probably chosen something different. But mine trumps it on age, and also trumps it on the fact that I found it. But this is probably one of the most regularly found of these things. There we go, lovely ammonite, about 195 million years ago. This died, and I was one of my favorite pastimes, apart from wandering around hedgerows looking for hedgehogs, is wandering along the beaches down near Lyme Regis. This is actually Charmouth Beach, and just waiting and watching and looking and trying to see those moments of pattern when you get that little ripple, which might be a footprint, but actually might also be a fossil. And there are people down there with their goggles and their hammers smashing stuff, but I walk and just watch and look, and it is one of the most amazingly meditative things. And this particular fossil, I'd had one of those nights, young children at the time, staying with my mother-in-law who lives down that way. And I had been up for most of the night, and I was really hating everybody. And I checked the time for the tide. The tide was just going out. And at dawn, I just went down to the coast and walked along the beach. All of the professional fossil hunters ahead of me. And they'd walk straight past this one. And this is just one of the best. It was initially very pyretized, and I had a decision to make. Either I could preserve it properly and not touch it, and preserve all of the iron pyrites, the sort of gold color on it, or I could leave it to oxidize and fade away, but actually share it with people and they can touch it. So anyway, I think it's just magical. It makes me very happy.
Yeah, it's a wonderful Now, we have an enormous number of questions. I'll also mention, by the way, I said at the beginning, we've got a bunch of shows out. Our latest book, Shambles, is with Tom Allen, about his book about growing up in Bromley and what it was like to be a child feeling slightly on the outside. So it's a lovely book, and I would highly recommend it. So that's another thing that's on Cosmic Shambles at the moment, Tom Allen with Josie Long and me. Let's start with a question from Maria, who is 7 years old. Hello, Maria. Maria would like to know, how do dolphins and whales hold their breath for so long? Helen S, because I've realised we have to denote which Helen on this occasion.
Dolphins and whales hold their breath. Well, certainly I want to tell you, I want to go back to sperm whales again, but actually, because they hold their breath for like an hour or more, dolphins for slightly less. One thing they all have is a type of protein in their blood which holds onto oxygen and it's actually in their muscles as well. So we have hemoglobin in our blood, which is basically what holds onto the oxygen in our lungs and then puts it into our tissues and the other parts of our body. But these dolphins and whales also have something called myoglobin, which it holds on to a lot more oxygen. And in fact, they have absolutely masses of this stuff in their muscles, like 10 times as much, to the point where technically it should actually make them kind of solid and they should be able to move. Their muscles should actually become these kind of solid lumps. But what some scientists found out is that they have this slightly different version of this molecule, which is slightly repellent. So it's like a kind of non-stick version of myoglobin, so that they can stay nice and supple and swim around in the ocean still with loads and loads of this oxygen holding compound in their muscles. So that it's not just it's not just the oxygen in their lungs they're using to hold their breath and keep down for that long. It's also in the rest of their body. So I think for a sperm whale, their lungs collapse very quickly as they dive down because of the pressure, and they're completely reliant on this massive store of oxygen in the rest of their body. And so they can go down for absolutely ages. So they have lots of different adaptations. One thing I would love to know, though, and I don't know if we ever will, is how do they feel when they need to breathe? Because obviously, for us air-breathing land mammals, we can, recognize that feeling of, okay, I've swam down, I'm holding my breath for like a minute and I need to come back up, and you feel a bit panicky. I'd love to know what a whale feels when it gets to that point, or whether there's just some kind of chemical cue and they're like, okay, time to come back up. Everything's fine. Just get back to the surface and breathe again. And like sperm whales actually spend like 3/4 of their lives in the deep. They come back up. It takes them about 8 minutes to exchange the oxygen again into their muscles and into their bodies, and back down they go. And they just keep diving. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I know it's difficult to talk about. Thomas Nagel wrote about what is it to be a bat and what is it to be a whale on another, but because that's its natural existence, whereas of course us diving in water is an unnatural existence. Yeah, it's intriguing, isn't it, to get some sense of what that consciousness would be, especially of such an intelligent other animal.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would love that. To be able to kind of climb further into the minds of whales and sperm whales and these wonderful intelligent creatures. Maybe one day we will. Who knows?
Terrible things. We might find out they're not thinking these beautiful things we imagined. Now, I can answer the next question, but only because Hedgehog Awareness Week asked me to film a small piece about it. I was given the information, but Hugh will know this off the top of his head. Matt would like to know, how do I make a hedgehog-friendly area in my garden?
Go on, Robin. Go on. You do it.
Well, it's if you can, just what you want to do, kind of a reasonably unruly log pile, which will work for shelter and also attract bugs, which will mean it'll be good for food. But do put out clean water as well.
This is brilliant. I can actually probably retire now. That's fantastic.
I think that's the first time he's answered a question.
I never did.
It's for over a year, and it might.
A man has got to be aware of his limitations. That was taught to me by the film Dirty Harry, and it didn't make me take up guns, but it did make me realise my limitations.
I think we should give you a round of applause for answering, because we're all learning, right? And we. So I think it's great that you also have taken your turn at answering a question. It's great.
That's it for this year again in 2022, when I might answer something else about caterpillars.
I will add a little bit more, and it's the easy bit, which is just to do less gardening. I mean, it's the cult of tidiness, which is at the heart of the loss of so much of the natural world. And so you just basically leave a bit to go wild. When we took the Hedgehog Street campaign, took a display garden to the Royal Horticultural Show at some place in London, and it was the first time ever people had turned up to that thing and planted brambles. It was like, this is what we're doing. We wanted to show you can do these things, still have a beautiful looking garden, but just share rather than persecute everything around you. And actually probably the top thing Matt can do, though, is, because if he's asking this question, he's probably already quite tuned in, probably already quite sensitive to it. It's talk to your neighbours, because if you're going to be doing nice things, that's great. But if then your neighbour has decided to build a carport in the front and put plastic grass in the back and glyphosate everything else with an inch of its life, then it creates an environment which is very, very degraded for everything to be able to share. So yeah, maybe communication is almost as important as the act itself.
Wonderful. Some of the churchyards and cemeteries are absolutely perfect. There's one near me which has got a bug hotel at the back, where it gets most unruly, but they've allowed it to just grow, and it still looks beautiful, and it's still it's a different story altogether. I think the manicured cemetery, I always find a very strange thing, when I think actually seeing life growing from it is a far more joyous thing than a well-kept lawn.
But it's slightly complicated, the cemetery thing. There's a village just north of Oxford called Kirtlington, where I've done a lot of work. They've done amazing things with their stone walls and making little smoots in them for all the hedgehogs to be able to move through the gardens. But with the cemetery, they've also done the bug thing there too. But they actually put signs up. So because for about 2 or 3 weeks each year, it looks really, really awful when it's just everything's dying, and they want the seed heads to develop and then shed the seeds. And so they do need to put messages up, because people do complain. People will do stupid things and go in there and try and tidy it up. But yeah, we just need to educate, and it'll help in the end.
Brilliant.
Can I ask a quick question while we're on hedgehogs and cemeteries? Because I have got a burning question I wanted to ask you. Last year, I have a cemetery across the road from me, and it is very lovely, and there's lots of wildlife, and it is sort of left. I don't know if they have bug hotels and things, but it does feel quite a wild space in Cambridge. And anyway, last year I was going for a walk, and it was the middle of the afternoon, and there was a hedgehog eating a pile of looked like kind of veggie clippings that someone had stuck over the back of their wall, and it was climbing around. A few of us stopped and watched, and I was really kind of worried, like, should it be out at that time of day?
On dogs out in daytime, it's poorly. And so they're nocturnal as a species. It actually, the reason why people think that hedgehogs are covered in fleas is because the hedgehog you're most likely to see is a hedgehog out in daytime. And if the hedgehog's out in daytime, it's more likely to be covered in parasites and infested with parasites inside as well. And therefore, the hedgehog you most like to see, because it's simply easier to see them in the daytime, is the one which is poorly. But yeah, on the whole, they're ill if they're out in the daytime. And they're probably not eating the clippings, but there'll be insects in and amongst the clippings, which will be there because they're carnivorous. And there used to be, oh God, taxonomists. You'd have thought the taxonomists would go, we've done this bit, we'll move on and do something else. But no, they've done this bit. They made hedgehogs insectivores. That's simple. And then actually, you know what? Insectivore's not right anymore. We're going to call it something else. It took me 3 days to work out how you have to say Eulipotyphlon. Eulipotyphlon, that's what they are now. Eulipotyphlon. What does that tell us? Insectivore, obvious. They eat insects. Eulipotyphlon means truly fat and blind, which I think is really quite uncharitable.
Also, of all the creatures you could call that, I would top of the list.
Yeah, well, also it's not actually a reference to the obvious morphology. It's to do with their cecum, and to do it's a blind-headed. Yeah, it's
complicated.
Yeah.
Well, now, in the tradition of Sunday brunch, we move on to the recipe section. Now, I missed your tweets this morning, Helen, because I was engaged in talking about some rather parlous piece of BBC journalism. But someone says they would like to know more about your favourite algae recipes. So can you tell us, first of all, what this tweet was, and now tell us about what these recipes might be?
You know, occasionally you wake up in the morning and you're ever so slightly grumpy and you spot something and then you get a bit grumpy and then you have to say something about it. And one of my bees in my bonnet, I don't know what I was looking at this morning, but an advert flashed up which kind of said, get your healthy fish oils and get your omega-3s and you must eat enough fish. And I was like, so I tweeted. And what I tweeted basically said, it is not true that you need to eat fish to get enough omega-3 to be healthy, because the fish do not make the omega-3s. The fish eat something else, which makes the omega-3s. So we could just eat the something else. And the something else is algae. And the big fish eat the little fish. So that the omega-3s just pass down. By the time they get to us, if you had a big fish, for example, if you got your omega-3s from, I don't know, tuna or something, it's been through quite a lot of, it's quite impressive. Those molecules have been through a lot of animals on their way to get to you. However, you could just eat the thing at the bottom of the food chain, which is the algae, and seaweed are algae. So there are various things. So spirulina, which people, I think, put in smoothies and, health things, that is a form of algae. It's a sort of bright green thing that I don't put in smoothies, but, it's not just the microscopic algae. There are the macroalgae, which are the seaweeds. And I thought I should probably look up how much omega-3 fatty acids are produced by different types of algae. I didn't have time to do that this morning before I started ranting. But when it comes to seaweed, actually, in the UK, the easiest example is probably lava bread, which is a Welsh traditional food. And there's actually the British are unusual. So there's in around Essex, there's I can't remember what they call it. I have tell you what, I have got a whole book on seaweed food. But so it's actually, we are unusual in not having seaweed in our food culture, because actually most other places seaweed, it's not uncommon. It's us that are the exceptions. So when I eat seaweed, it tends to be sort of the sprinkled on top variety. But I have been looking for a seafood recipe book, so I haven't got recommendations yet, but I will soon. And I'm going to have a quick nose around to see if I can find my seaweed. There's a book written by someone whose name I've forgotten, but she's in London, and it's got all about seaweed. I'll show you the cover. I'll go and have a look for it in a second. But yeah, but basically lava bread is a good start. And
brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we'll do it. Well, next week maybe we can have something. I'll make something. You make something. Let's see if we can bring the recipes there. That'll get us onto daytime, full time. It'll be great. This is a question from Neil. Helen, you've probably been asked this quite a few times, and it came up a couple of weeks ago. I've still not seen this film. I was kind of advised just not to bother. I reckon you know which documentary I'm going to talk about, which is Seaspiracy. And first of all, have you seen it? Secondly, what was your opinion? Because I know there's been a lot of kind of debate and questioning from the evidence-based science areas.
Yes, I'm sure the other Helen has watched this too, but I'm going to jump in. Seaspiracy. I mean, if I watched it, yes, I can see why a lot of people are upset with it. It simplifies things enormously. It sidesteps a lot of important issues, but it does get some things right as well. So I think I'm kind of torn about it, and I think time will tell whether in the long run it's going to do more harm than good in terms of raising awareness over the big issues. You can watch that film and you'll come away knowing that there are big problems in the oceans, which are industrial overfishing and harmful subsidies and at-sea slavery and bycatch and pollution, and those things are all absolutely true. There's no doubt that those things are big issues and we need to do something about them. The way the film portrays it is that overfishing is the single thing that is the worst thing about the way we're impacting the oceans, and the single thing that all of us can do to therefore solve that problem is to stop eating fish. Now, that I think is the oversimplistic part of it. And I think what's really important, and actually, if you do want to know more, we did make an episode of a podcast I present called Catch Our Drift. And we looked into kind of the truths and the sort of misleading parts of the film. And we looked into more detail on the issue of, can you sustainably fish the sea? Because the film kind of leads to the conclusion that that's impossible. And there are big hurdles to it. And obviously things like managing fisheries in the high seas a long way from shore is a big challenge, but it doesn't mean it can't be done. And so we actually spoke to other people who are looking at really kind of small scale sustainable fishing. We spoke to some amazing people in South Africa who are kind of connecting really small kind of artisanal fisher people with the customers directly and with restaurants and with consumers, so that they can be sure that the food they're getting is good, that they're paying a good price to the people who are catching it. We spoke to this incredible fisherman who was saying how his life was transformed by being able to basically sell his catches directly rather than to some middleman who's going to, give him crappy money and he wasn't going to make anything out of it. So, there are some really inspiring transformational stories about how we can sustainably use the oceans. Which I think is a bit more nuanced and important to look at, as opposed to the film is sort of saying we just have to step back and say we're not going to eat anything, take anything from the oceans at all, which I think is just, it's not going to work, for one. There's far too many people in the world who absolutely rely on the oceans. But there's smart ways we can do it. And actually, I want to say it kind of chimes in with what Helen was just saying about seaweed and omega-3s. And one thing about seaweed is that you can farm it, and it's actually kind of a net benefit to the ocean. It takes up carbon, it takes up nutrients. So seaweed farming is one of those things we definitely need to do more of. And here in Britain, we definitely can do it. And people are. I know friends of ours, mine are running a seaweed farm up in the north, and people are doing it more. But what we need is to get it into our diets. We need to eat more basically kind of vegetarian sushi and stuff like that. We need to use these seaweed products in our diets here. Because otherwise we're getting omega-3s from things like krill that are fished in the Antarctic, which is such a terrible idea. I mean, this is penguin food and whale food is being industrially hoovered out of the Antarctic waters to make things like omega-3 supplements. We definitely don't need to be doing that. We should be eating seaweed. So, there are ways we can use the oceans in a much more sustainable way. And I think that's what that film was kind of missing the point on a bit as well, which was the good things that we can and we are doing in terms of, sustainably supporting people and their livelihoods from the
something very quick about that, because I think actually one of my bigger problems with, so I didn't watch the film because I didn't want to give Netflix the click, because what bothers me about it is that what they want is the click. If you put something out that's super controversial, people click on it, they argue over it, and then they will make another one that oversimplifies the argument. So I think the bigger problem with Seaspiracy is actually the tribal nature of it. It's deliberately
it's polarizing,
pitting people against each other. So it's a great big fight purely for attention. And that's more dangerous than anything that's actually in the film, I think. And there's a lot of stuff in the film that, by all accounts, is really just damaging because it's simplistic. So it's the style of the film that I don't want to encourage, because if we go down that route, I mean, everything's stuffed, right? We have to appreciate nuance. So that's the bigger problem with the film, I think.
You've got a big battle on your hand, Helen. I think we all have, in terms of that. And I totally agree. Yes, the demand for nuance. And this question from Andrew. I think this has come about because something his sons have been saying to him, but he wants to check with you, Hugh, that hedgehogs as pets is a terrible idea.
I mean, it really depends. I mean, of course, we need to have nuance on all of these things. You can have something which appears to be a really, really bad idea, and we can have subtlety and nuance about it. If you live in a country which doesn't have a native population of hedgehogs, and you're willing to take on board a nocturnal animal as a pet, which likes to run a great deal at night on a wheel, and as it's running, because the hedgehog has a coat of spines, it will go and defecate. Doesn't need to go and hide to defecate. It'll just poo as it runs. So what it does is poos in the wheel as it's running, and so what then happens is it gets sprinkled in this sort of fecal matter, which then drops between the spines, and then it's required to be cleaned with a toothbrush. If you want that sort of a pet, then you should consider it. But the problem, I mean, obviously it's ridiculous. The problem in this country and in the UK is that we've got our own native hedgehogs, and whenever you get an exotic pet dealer coming along and saying, "Oh, we've just got these very, very cute pygmy hedgehogs," as they're known as. There's different African species of hedgehog which have been bred specifically, and people start trying to sell native hedgehogs. They get bored of their pet hedgehogs. They release them into the wild. They die. The habit has sprung from the exotic pet keepers in America, where these hedgehogs became an absolutely must-have fad pet for quite some time. And having then gone to the International Hedgehog Olympic Games and the Rocky Mountain Hedgehog Show, and spent a great deal of time recognizing that I was the most normal person in the room, I heartily argue against the idea of having pet hedgehogs over here. I mean, it's exotic pets, and exotic pets work. Well, you need to understand exotic pets. You just follow the money. Who's making money out of it? They're breeding these animals. They're going to try and sell them to profit. That's why these things work. So thank you. Don't. It would be the thing to say there. And but there's. Yeah, I'm sure there are many others out there who'd have a sort of a view on exotic pets, but I find it, we've got our pets, they've been domesticated. Wild animals, don't cage them.
Thank you very much. You're watching Sunday Science Q&A. I should just mention, as I mentioned before, the latest Uncanny Hour is all about I Am Legend, and also on Cosmic Shambles you can hear Tips for Existence. Our most recent guest from last week is Chris Jackson, who was one of the Christmas lecturers this year, or just at the end of last year. And one of the other Christmas lecturers was Helen Czerski, who's now going to answer a question about bubbles. This is from Adela, who's aged 8. Hello, Adela. And she would like to know, could bubbles found in stones near a fossil contain gas which could be analysed in the lab?
Not a fossil bone. So the thing about bubbles, there's this very nice idea, right, that if you trap things under stuff and you can keep it all trapped, then you should be able to come back 1,000 or 1,000,000 years later and the same stuff should be in there. And it sometimes works in ice, for example. So ice, when snow falls in Antarctica and it gets compacted and compacted, you do get little pockets of gas that do actually stay stopped, shut away in the solid, and you can go back to them for a long time afterwards and look at them. And that's actually the best way of finding ancient atmospheres. The problem, when you go back to fossils, there's two problems with the fossils. One is that in order for there to be a fossilization process, you need there's chemistry going on. There's an exchange of chemistry, of molecules coming and going, and that means that they'll be exchanging with whatever's in your little gas pocket. So it's a porous boundary. Molecules are coming and going. So what's in there is highly likely to change. And the other thing is that over the timescales needed for the sort of fossils like the one Hugh was showing, you're talking 100 million years, 200 million years. All that has to happen in your tiny pocket is that just a few times in those 100 million years, an oxygen molecule has to go one way, or a carbon dioxide molecule has to sneak off into the rock. And the chances after such a long period of everything being intact in your bubble are really small. So if you could get there right afterwards, like a volcano, for example, and it's, the lava solidifies and you get your bubble, that's probably not going to change very much. But in the sort of sediments where you get fossils, there will be an exchange with the surroundings. And so although you can do it with ice, I don't think you can do it with fossils.
Thank you, Helen. A question for you, Hugh, from Shirley. Shirley says, just so you know, I'm not opposed to the idea, but I'm curious, what are the advantages of reintroducing beavers to areas of the UK?
Oh, my goodness me. Well, that's perfectly timed, as I have just finished the text for the Beaver book. This is the Hedgehog book, of course, but the Beaver book will come out in October, all being well. I just now need to very carefully do the picture research. But the thing about the beaver is that they're ecosystem engineers. They were wiped out, functionally extinct about 400 years ago, but there's some evidence that they were still around 200 or 300 years ago in the UK. When you reintroduce beavers into a landscape, they chop down trees. They chop down trees to build dams. They build dams to create security for themselves. They build a lodge in the dam and where they can raise their young. But they also build dams to get a pond created so they can store food in the cold water. They invented refrigeration long before we did. And their food is just the bark of trees and the leaves of trees. So they dig those down into the ground so they can come and get them when the leaves aren't on the trees. But in the process of doing this, they are unhomogenizing our landscape. They're creating difference. They are increasing the roughness, the fractals, I presume, of this sort of area. And so the whole thing becomes a much more diverse ecosystem. And so what you will end up with, and so some good friends of mine up in Scotland, in Alyth, up in Perthshire, they have released beavers onto their estate. And I went up there, and it's to see what happens. To begin with, it can look a bit messy, but within a couple of years, very quickly, the whole thing begins to become just an absolute magnet for invertebrates, for amphibians, for reptiles, and for the bird life, which then comes to feed on these things, and for the mammals that feed on these things too. They're an absolute cornerstone species. They transform a landscape. They create it. I mean, they don't just build the dams and make the lakes. They dig out canals, which they will use to be able to drag bigger bits of wood down to their main ponds. So if we've got some space, they can transform the landscape really well. There's been some really interesting work done looking at the impact of the beavers being released down on the River Otter, which is really kind of mixed up anyway. And down in Devon and Somerset, there are beavers now down there. The River Otter project shows that you get a massive benefit from having the beavers present for wildlife, but you also get massive benefits because the beaver dams slow the progress of water. When you have a flood event, potentially heavy downpours of rain, water travels down the rivers more slowly. And this means that you actually reduce flooding. And there's work done, I think it was in Bavaria, and actually was costing it and showing how much people had saved in money by having beavers in the landscape because they had impounded water, making it trickle back down through the landscape more slowly. So yeah, they are an ecological wonder. And I think they're a marvel. I really, really look forward to more projects like this. There's a talk of them being released onto the Isle of Wight. They've been released in Sussex, I think, on the Downs, and obviously the Scottish beavers. They're going to be all over the place and good.
Excellent. Thank you, Hugh. Helen S., question for you from Nikki. How come when coral reefs die out, they aren't able to grow back like forms of vegetation?
Well, corals are not plants. They're partly plant, but they're mainly animal. Can I get you? I'm just going to get you some coral, actually. Hang on. This wasn't planned, but I happen to have a piece.
Of course, everyone we have on, they happen to have a fossil somewhere, a piece of coral somewhere else, eardrums of all manner of animals.
Yeah. This was left over from a project I did years ago on the illegal trade in ornamental corals. And I was studying, London Zoo basically had this massive consignment that came over from the Philippines and was seized because it didn't have the correct permits. And I was studying what they had, and I might have possibly not put back a few of them. I will eventually. Anyway, so corals are animals. They relatives of sea anemones and distantly to jellyfish, and they build these amazing structures out of calcium carbonate, out of chalk, essentially. They do have tiny algae living inside them, which help them to grow, but they do need that kind of symbiosis between animals and plants to grow. So if you can see nice and close, you've got these little nubbins, and each one of those would have been an individual coral in this beautiful colony from the Philippines. So corals, they can regrow, and they do. That's the kind of the hopeful message I think that we can take from things like hearing about how the Great Barrier Reef is in trouble in Australia, various other places too, get hit by warming seas, and they undergo a process called coral bleaching, where those algae living inside the corals get cross and basically leave, or the corals get a bit cross and spit them out, and they turn white. So they would look a bit like this, a dead coral that's left afterwards, after everything's died. But we do know, in that case, we do know, for example, that some corals can be more tolerant to bleaching. Some can actually recover afterwards. And then you can get regrowth. So corals are animals. They produce sperm and eggs, and those produce larvae, which can drift off and reseed areas, and corals can regrow that way. So what we really need is to keep corals, I mean, we obviously need to do something about climate change. We have to do that, but we also need to keep corals as healthy as they can be from other impacts like fishing and pollution and so on, so that they have that chance to regrow and to produce those offspring that can then go and drift through the seas, and put the corals back where they were before, possibly even in new places if the seas are warming and it's going to expand towards the poles. Possibly we're seeing that already in some places in Japan and in America. Coral reefs are kind of popping up in places where recently they weren't, but because the seas are warming up, that's happening. So it's a little bit more complicated than just plants, but I guess in a similar way, if we keep the seas as healthy as we can, if we keep pollution at bay as much as we can, then there is a good chance that stuff will grow back, and it's not hopefully all lost, because these things are incredibly beautiful, and so many other species rely on coral reefs too. They only cover a quarter of the oceans, but they contain they cover 1% of the oceans and contain a quarter of all the ocean species. So they're immensely important.
Thank you very much.
It's probably just worth saying as well that it's really in a forest, you could grow a tree seedling somewhere else and then go and plant some tree seedlings. And corals are really complicated, and getting corals to reproduce artificially is really, really hard. So we don't have the equivalent of a nursery on land where we can grow some baby, plant them in the environment, because it just doesn't work because it's too complicated, and that does make it a bit harder. But makes a fascinating study.
People are trying doing the coral nurseries. It's also just in the scale of it is massive. The idea of trying to replant the barrier reef, 200 kilometers long. I mean, just ridiculously enormous size. No, it's bigger than that. But so I don't think we can rely on replanting as the way. We really have to kind of let the corals make themselves better as well. I think that's going to hopefully be a better solution in the long run, hopefully.
Helen S, that is. So the structure you're holding there, that a physical thing which is being built by the action of the coral, the animal, will other corals come back in and live within the same place, or do they have to build their own structure?
Most corals will need to build their own structure. I mean, other things will come and colonize dead corals, most likely seaweeds, actually. They'll get smothered over by seaweeds that will come along, depending on if there's fish around to eat them. But no, each coral builds its own colony and then sort of splits itself off by budding and creates different things. You get solitary corals that are just one big animal, a polyp we call it. Others, like the branching ones, will get massive ones called brain corals, which are just a boulder basically with a thin veneer of life on the outside. But as far as I'm aware, I suppose corals could probably come and land on an old boulder coral and start growing again, but I don't think they wouldn't move into these little holes basically. No.
Now a question. We mentioned Gliss at the beginning, and Leanne wants to know more, because we talked about Gliss also, Hugh, when you were on Book Shambles a while ago, and a lot of people have never heard of Gliss. Leanne says, I've lived in the UK all of my life, never heard of such a thing, let alone seen one. Of course, actually, you're unlikely to see them. Are they endangered? Are they some sort of mammalian secret? More Gliss news, please.
So Gliss. They're actually an alien species. I mean, they're not one of our native species. And in some instances, they're quite a pest. They will take up residence inside people's houses, and they will nibble and gnaw at things such as electric cables, old photograph albums, and insulation. So there is a problem, because they're also very endangered. There's a whole habit, called the edible doormats, because people did used to eat them. In fact, there was a whole, there's a Latin word, the glissaria, actually a thing you would keep your gliss in to fatten them up before you then cart them off to the kitchens. So no, there aren't that many mammals in this country, but they're there aren't that many of them themselves, of gliss. They are mostly in the sort of south, in the Downs areas, the sort of Sussex area. There's a band of them around there, and moving up to the Chilterns, if I remember rightly. But I could point you to the direction of Dr. Pat Morris, who knows an awful lot more about the dormice of this world. But yes, spend some time digging around in those books of the mammals of this country, and you'll find some wonderful things. They look furry, they look cuddly, but probably don't, because they've also got quite sharp teeth.
Yeah, they are very interesting. Have a look. And Pat Morris, you're right, is great on the subject, and they sound terrifying as well. If you do happen to get them between the floorboards, they don't just sound like a mouse scuttling around. They're not that much bigger than a mouse. Yeah, they are a little bit bigger, but they sound enormous. It actually sounds like you've got kind of rabid beavers in the house, as I found out when I was doing some work at my dad's place. Now I don't know if I'm gonna ask this question directly or say it, go to another one, but just warn you all, because the next one is from Magenpie, and it's, what is the strangest animal behavior you know about? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to the next question, but then come back to that to give you a little chance to think about this. This is from Diff Mike, who would like to know, I understand most of the science behind a rainbow, and that when there's a second one, the colours are reversed. How can you theoretically get on top of the other? So this is now, so double rainbows. We're talking about a double rainbow scenario
That's on
here.
top of it.
Yeah, I'm not in touch. So is that about, I'm trying to think about the way that the movement of the sun, the rain.
So basically, the way it works is, if you see a rainbow, the sun is always directly, but if you look straight at the middle of the rainbow, the sun is always directly behind you, and what you are actually seeing is your own personal rainbow. If you imagine a line that comes from the sun right through your head, there's an arc 42 degrees away from that line, and you see a circle. So if you and the person next to you do not see the same, you have to be at the center of your own circle. And the way rainbows are formed is that you get tiny droplets. So for a rainbow, they do have to be spherical droplets, and the sun is either bounced once or twice inside the droplet before it comes back at you. And if it bounces once, the colors spread out in a way to get the rainbow we're used to, and if it bounces twice, the colors are all reversed. So that's the rainbow. I'm not sure about the on top of it, but it also means that you'll never find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, because the problem is the end of the rainbow moves with you. So the goalposts are literally moving. So you take your rainbow with you, but you won't ever get to the end of it. In fact, if you're high enough up, you can see a whole. If you were on top of a very pointy mountain and the sun was high behind you, you could theoretically see a whole. It's just that you can't see the bits that are below. But I'm not quite sure about the bit in the question about getting on top.
I'm not sure about the double rainbow. I've got to say, if anyone lives down Dartmouth or nearby in Devon, that is a great place to. I was down there quite a few months ago now, but it's one of those ones where the hill opposite Dartmouth, just across the River Dart, is perfect for actually getting, because quite often you see most of a rainbow, don't you? And then it kind of fades towards an edge, but that is the perfect one to go and see the televisual kind of, the Geoffrey Bungle and Zippy rainbow we were brought up in animation as kids. If you want to ask that question again, because I might have put all of the stresses in the wrong place, which has made it more confusing. So we can come back to that one next week if you'd like to hear more about that sense of the double rainbow and exactly the intention behind the question. Rosie, I've
got a live question from
great
Helen S. If we've got,
yeah.
You're not getting the live one. So for Karen, while we were on air, has asked, this is for Helen S. She said, as a young child, she had a book about the deep ocean, and she was really scared by the picture of the anglerfish. And can you explain how their light works and how they turn it on and off?
Brilliant. Yes, anglerfish. There's lots and lots of species of these brilliant deep water fish. I guess they're mostly in the midnight zone and deeper, so deeper than about 1,000 meters. And they're famous for these big, scary mouths. But that's important when you're in the deep, because there's not that much around to eat. So you pretty much have to shove in anything you find. So your mouth needs to be as big as possible so that you can physically get it into your body. But they have these lures. Some of them, most of them sticking out sort of a prong on the top of their head. Some have glowing beards as well, sticking down. So a lot of them have bacteria living in those little bulbs at the end of this prong sticking out the top of their heads, which are bioluminescent. They have these chemicals. They have genes that produce two kinds of molecules that, when they combine, carry out a chemical reaction that releases light. So I think those ones are basically, if you've got a bacterial form of bioluminescence, the only way to control that light, because they glow all the time, is to have some kind of shutter to kind of close them on and off. And I don't think anglerfish do that, possibly. I think it might just have to have a constant glow. There are other fish that have sort of shutters, and they can wink in the dark, like lanternfish can actually kind of close the lights off, like the headlights on a car almost. But then there are some anglerfish that have not only a bacterial glow coming out the top, but they'll have a different kind of bioluminescence in that beard at the bottom, and they have their own genes to make those chemicals, so they kind of have this more kind of inherent ability to produce the light, so then they can control when the light goes on and off. So you actually get in some fish kind of these sort of dual bioluminescence in one animal, which is pretty amazing. So they've evolved it kind of twice, but in one species. And we think it's all probably about attracting food. So having a kind of flashing light for those animals is probably that other smaller fish might be like, what's this, and come along and look at it, and then they get turn into the anglerfish's dinner. So that's how.
Others, Helen, that have come through?
Yes, there is another one from Caroline. And Caroline wants to know, is there a best bit of the garden for putting a hedgehog feeding station? And perhaps you could tell us what a hedgehog feeding station is while you're at it.
Okay, so hedgehog feeding station. The thing about feeding hedgehogs is you're putting out food which is the favourite food of foxes, cats, dogs, the birds in the morning, all those sorts of things, and rats. And so you want to try and put the food out in such a way that the hedgehogs will eat it, but the other animals will leave it alone. And so if you search online, you can find all sorts of amazing designs, really clever designs, because what people have discovered is that many cats are essentially fluid. And so that whilst you may think you've created enough of a maze to be able to try and let the hedgehog snuffle through to the food, the cat sort of extends itself around like a snake to get to the food. But essentially the point is you upturn box, brick on top of it, partition into the box, 13-centimetre hole, so that hedgehog goes in, comes around a corner, comes back again, and feeds in the corner near the entrance, but with a partition. This also tends to stop rats feeding on it, because rats don't like being caught in a corner whilst they're feeding. Best place to put in the garden depends on the purpose of your doing it. If you're doing it out of the goodness of your own heart because you just want to feed hedgehogs, put it down the back of your garden. But if you want to do it such that you have an increased chance of seeing hedgehogs, put it somewhere closer. I don't think it's going to make a massive difference to what the hedgehogs will do, but they will be are forever thankful for you putting out meaty pet food. And apparently kitten kibble, meaty kitten kibble, is the favourite thing at the moment for hedgehogs. They go through phases.
Now, here's the question then. What is the strangest animal behaviour you know about? Helen S., let's start with you.
Well, I mean, I could choose almost anything in the deep ocean, but I know we talked about it last time, but I think I have to go with Yeti crabs. These deep sea crabs that grow bacteria in their hairy arms and then eat them. And no, it's not any bacteria, it's weird chemosynthetic bacteria that don't need sunlight to grow but use chemicals to produce food. So it's this completely alternative form of life that we had no idea about until hydrothermal vents, black smokers, were found in the 1970s. And these guys were discovered much more recently. And they do look a bit like Yetis. They've got these amazing kind of blonde furry arms, and they wave their arms in the chemicals in the water so they can grow these bacteria. And there's another species which has hair on its chest. I think I showed you that last time, the Hoff Crab, named after David Hasselhoff, because he had a hairy chest, I guess, as well when he was in Baywatch. And again, those bacteria they farm bacteria on their bodies and then sort of scrape them up and eat them. There you go.
Well, I'm not actually going to pick an ocean one, which I feel a bit bad about, but I went with some friends to a city farm yesterday, and there were rabbits, and we had the conversation about rabbits eating their dinner twice. And so I think it's just it's only weird because it's very clever and sensible, but it shows how weird we are because we think it's weird. So what rabbits do is they nibble on grass, which has a lot of cellulose, isn't too great on, it's quite dilute in other nutrients. So they nibble down all the grass and the cellulose, and that's all fine. But then inside the rabbit, there's a sort of sorting process, and all the cellulose that they can't digest, that carries on down the digestive tract, and all the stuff that might be useful gets kind of diverted off to one side to a special little organ inside the rabbit. And so the other stuff carries on down. That's rabbit poo. That's fine. The stuff that's gone into the special little thing gets partially dealt with, but then the rabbit still needs to get it back into its digestive system so it can eat it properly. So it basically poos it out the same orifice and then eats it straight out of that orifice so it can go back down to have it properly. So rabbits tend to do this at night, and which is why you may not have seen a rabbit doing this. But if you happen to be out at dusk and you see a rabbit eating, looks like it's eating from somewhere below its tummy, it's having its second dinner.
Hey, Hugh W.
I hard to top the autophagy thing. You did it so well. It was almost like Blue Peter level. I really like that. That was all of the nice words you used in it. Eating your dinner twice. I was going to talk about something which is slightly ruder, but I won't. So I'll talk about self-anointing in hedgehogs, just because it's It seems like it's the most obviously, so you can explain it quite easily. But occasionally you will come across a hedgehog which will build up a froth of saliva on its mouth, and then it will contort its body and with a very remarkably long tongue spread the saliva across its spines. And so the immediate thing, well, this must be something to do with scent or whatever. But some hedgehogs are stimulated to do it because they've come across something new as a flavor. If you've washed your hands with scented soap and you pick up a hedgehog, that could stimulate them to do it. Other people have seen it because they've been chewing on cigar stubs or whatever. Really strong flavors generate this. But other hedgehogs have been stimulated to do it with distilled water. So there's no clear link with that. And so we don't actually know what it's about. Possibly spread of some pheromones. But what it can be about is really, really, really annoying me as a photographer when I've got a TV crew there with a rescue hedgehog and we're launching a big hedgehog project and we've got a hedgehog out on the lawn and it's a rescued one. It's going to be released into the wild and we put it out on the lawn. The TV crew's there. They're filming it. I'm taking photographs and it wanders across the lawn and finds chicken poo. And it chews on the chicken poo and starts self-anointing, lathering itself in just masticated chicken shit and then making it a really unlovely looking sort of animal to then pick up and do your piece to camera with. So we're not entirely sure what stimulates it other than just a chance to irritate me.
Saw how Helen Czerski shows how you can get your part in the audition of a Blue Peter job, and Hugh's shown how you will not get a second call there. We're going to end on, we've got a question about the environment, and I was just briefly going to mention something because of that, which is some of you might know, many of you probably won't, but about a month and a half ago I decided to pull out of doing an event at the Science Museum over some of their involvement with fossil fuel companies, and in the last couple of weeks there's been an announcement that their climate change exhibition is actually going to be sponsored by Shell, which is something that I'm kind of troubled by, but I don't know very much. I mean, this is always the problem when you make decisions of these things, is trying to do some research. But I just want to recommend, because it is one of my favourite museums, and because I do find and because this exhibition is opening very soon, have a look at Culture Unstained online, which has done a lot of campaigning about the for instance, the National Theatre, art galleries, etc. and then go to lots of other places as well. Do lots of research, but I just wanted to mention that as we're moving on to something environmental, that is something that I find troubling, and I think it's worth having a look, especially because something like the Science Museum, if it appears they're giving a seal of approval to fossil fuel companies, like, if the Science Museum says they're okay, they must be doing really great work and we should just leave them alone. That's my position on it anyway. Rose's question is, how can we get people to connect with the deep sea and how it affects above ground issues more? I've always felt that pollution seems like an easy thing to fight because people can see it. They can see the summers getting warmer and warmer, but how do we connect to a wider conservation message concerning the deep oceans? Helen S., can I start with you on that?
Such a good question. I mean, the oceans as a whole have this problem of being out of sight and out of mind, that most of us don't get to see what's down there, and the deep sea is the kind of the ultimate part of that. But now there is so many ways to kind of know more about the deep. So we have fantastic films, we have fantastic link ups with scientists, so you can now watch live expeditions as they're happening. They have these incredible deep diving robots with high definition cameras that are basically doing their research and looking and doing science in the bottom of the sea, miles down beneath the waves, but they're pinging images directly up to the ship, and it's going onto YouTube and onto the internet, and you can watch it. You can basically be kind of an armchair explorer. But I mean, I guess just in any way you can, teach yourself, learn about the deep sea. I hate to say it, but if you do want to know more, there is a book which also is full of resources for you to go and find other things. But we have got more eyes in the deep than we ever have before, more scientists looking, more amazing technologies to see what's in the deep. And crucially, your point about why it matters, finding those connections between these ecosystems and these places and these physical parts of this enormous space on our planet and stuff that we know about and that we are amongst up here on land and in the shallower seas. There are so many connections, biochemical connections, chemistry, biology is moving around all the time, heat's going into the deep sea, carbon's going into the deep sea. It's all so important. But we're learning more and more about that as well at the same time. So I think there's never been a better time to connect yourself to the deep, and there's lots of ways of doing that. Watch Octonauts. I'm sure there's plenty of amazing deep sea episodes in that as well. So yeah, just go out and find it. It's all out there.
Yeah, so I think actually the real solution to this problem is a change of perspective, and I think what we actually need is to be much better at seeing ourselves as part of a system and not separate to it. Because all of it, I mean, as Helen said, there's all these logical reasons, heat and carbon, and lots of, like, the ocean is an engine. That's what my next book's about. But the thing that humans need is to have some humility and to see ourselves, instead of something that sits on top of nature, as a part of a much larger system. It's the overview effect that an astronaut would have, this famous effect that when you look down on the tiny ball of Earth in space, and you see how small you are, actually you're part of that system. Every time you eat, every time you use anything, every time you move something around, you are just part of an engine, and you can choose how to be part of that engine, right? And I think it's that shift in perspective. Nothing is really going to change until we start seeing ourselves and enjoying being part of that system, because suddenly then when you have a plastic bottle, you're saying, well, this is going to go somewhere in my system. Well, it's not, there is no away. Away does not exist. Away is just another way of saying somewhere in the system that I can't see right now, but it's still in my system. And so I think that's the perspective. That's the only, that's unless we manage that, none of the rest of it is actually will make any difference whatsoever. I'm starting to, like, it's a shift in opinion about what it means to be human, and that we are part of a system and we can choose how to be part of that system, and that everything we touch is just, it plugs into or takes from somewhere else in the system. And once that comes across, and I think it's creeping around the edges a bit, it's not here yet, then it's different, because then it's not like, it's not like these sort of the documentaries where you see a beautiful animal from a long way away and it's over there and you're over here and you're sort of, there's this reverence for the animal. It's about that you're part of the same system. It's not over there. It's not somewhere special. It's part of us. And then people might do something about it. So I think it's to do with the framework for everything. Like, it's the whole problem. Much bigger.
Thank you very much. We've run out. I mentioned again, obviously, you've seen The Brilliant Abyss there by Helen Scales, Storm in a Teacup by Helen Czerski, the Hedgehog book, and Soon the Beaver book. Yes.
So Helen and I both have ocean podcasts, so that's great, because it means there are lots of ocean podcasts in the world. But I think Helen's is called Catch My Drift and mine is Ocean Matters, and they're sort of done in different things for different people. But if you're keen on sea ocean things, then both of those podcasts, Helen's is definitely worth a listen. It's up to you to judge the one I do.
I'll allow Hugh, you're allowed an extra plug as
Thank you so much. I was just going to point out that you were talking about the deep of the ocean, but actually the hedgehog is the way into all of these things, because as you talked about, Helen C, about the remove of the external, it's all too far away. It's at the bottom of the ocean. You're looking at it on a screen because it's on a podcast, or it's too distant. You need to find the wildlife which is close at home to begin the journey of studying ecology, to understand and appreciate ecology. And that's why the hedgehog trumps everything, because it's the animal you actually have a chance of getting close to. You actually have an opportunity of maybe getting nose to nose with this amazing predator. And once you've taken that step of recognizing this other creature as another sentient, amazing animal, bigger than 99% of all creatures that lived on the planet, this amazing animal, then maybe you begin to start the journey about looking into the ecosystem itself. And then you'll take your journey on to the deep oceans. But you need to start with something which is tangible, something which is there. And the birds that flit around your bird feeder are too distant and lacking in character, really. But the hedgehog is an animal which you really have got a chance with. So start with the hedgehog and end with the abyssal beasties.
I disagree about the character. There is a robin, and I'm not saying that due to my own kind of but in my dad's garden, which I feel is absolutely packed with character. Thanks very much for listening, watching, etc. All of these, by the way, are still online. You can hear them in audio form or video form. We've been doing them for over a year now. Lots of different panels, including astronauts and theoretical physicists and genetics, as well as a load of panels that we did about COVID-19, which is quite an interesting thing to go back to and see as the information built and the evidence built. So thank you very much. If you can support us via Patreon, as I mentioned, that is absolutely brilliant. The silent running episode, which Helen will be on, as well as Mark Kermode, Stuart Lee, Gemma Arrowsmith and Brian Cox. That will be out Friday at midnight, and we'll have a new book, Shambles, coming up as well. And next week's subject on Sunday at 3 p.m. We'll be talking about various different medical matters. So start sending your questions in now. Thanks to our producer, Trent Burton. If you're having a bank holiday this weekend, enjoy that part of the weekend, that extra bit. If you're not, enjoy whatever you have.